another thing that I wanted to sort of point out was, within storytelling is, aspects of narration, right? So Red, he narrates most of the story throughout the film, and that's pretty evident. But there is this moment where Brooks has like this moment of narration, and he gets to narrate something. And this is, I thought, was a very interesting part of the story because in comparison to the novella, if I've got this correctly, Brooks isn't really even given much depth or airtime, so to speak. He's very minor, I would say, as a character. But Darabont in the film, he definitely privileges Brooks and his character. This is shown when he's, released in the, into the wild again, into society, and he narrates this letter back to his friends in prison. And so here we've got, Brooks and his narration. And so why does he do this? Why is Darabont doing this? One thing that I sort of came to the conclusion with was that we see the story of Brooks, we see this perspective, and it shows the consequences of not humanizing or properly rehabilitating people who have been incarcerated. So the story and the consequences is that he will either reoffend or commit suicide, and so it becomes futile. What was the point in all that prison time? And so this, again, we see that story, narrative pan out, and that adds another layer to
Darabont's message of the consequences of what happens when people aren't properly rehabilitated. Yeah, because the shift in narrative voiceover definitely serves to amplify Brooks' voice. And I think the more exposure the audience gets to the prisoners' inner lives, the more we feel for them, and the more we feel for their fate.
Like no one else gets that narration privilege throughout the film.
No, I think the reason why he gets that privilege, I think, as you say, is because it's almost like a requiem. It's like his last soapbox. It's the last speech at his final words.
Yeah, well, that's why he engraves Brooks was here. It's like he is leaving his mark on the world.
He wants to matter.
Yeah, he wants to matter. I also think that they have that shift in narrative voiceover from Brooks to Red is because when Red follows the exact same trajectory on his release from prison, it's actually showing that Red is kind of an anomaly in a way, because not all prisoners end up that way. Whereas if we didn't have Brooks' story on the outside unfold, then we may not think of Red's story as that remarkable, because we might have the assumption that when prisoners are freed, they do just live out a normal life, when in fact the majority of them don't.
There's some statistic out there. I'm pretty sure that there's a majority of them reoffend. And that's, that's a comment. That's, why aren't we thinking about that? Why aren't we talking about that? And I think Brooks's story allows us
a more
to
realistic portrayal.
Have that conversation, sort of evokes that conversation and, what it means to be, rehabilitated. I also think that audiences gain access to Tommy's story. Tommy's story, he's not privileged in narration or anything, but we do get a little insight into his story and his background, and there's a moment where he's actually telling a story about how he got caught, and I think again that layer of storytelling. But I think most importantly with Tommy is you've got how his purpose, I guess in some ways, is to tell the story of Elwood Blatch, who was the guy who murdered Andy's wife and lover, and the wife's lover. And I think that's that late again, that sort of transition and the storytelling, that the stories are really important. They're sort of, not only do they move the plot along, but they are aspects of knowledge and understanding. And does that make sense?
Because Tommy, to me, he's not just a side character. He gets probably about 20 minutes of screen time, and for that 20 minutes the focus is pretty much solely on him and Andy's attempts at educating him. So I think that goes back to what you were saying before about like why his perspective is in the story and like why there's different layers of the story.
Yeah, and I think like in that moment where like Tommy starts to put like two and two together is that that Elwood Blatch guy is just, he keeps talking and talking and talking. He keeps, telling his stories over and over again. And I think that's an interesting spin on the storytelling, like and I guess in a negative, is it a negative? Because it ends up being positive. It sort of, unfolds, I guess, truth. And then I guess, another layer is that, I guess Christian meta-narrative, that sort of layer, that sort of, is a bit of an overtone throughout the film, where the Bible quotes that are said, those quotes stem from their own like sort of gospel story on an individual level, and then you've got that wider narrative of Jesus and that aspect of the Savior and Andy, which parallels Andy. Sorry, so again. As you can see, there are so many aspects of storytelling, and they're significant because it sort of allows us to see. I guess in a way, I guess the narrative, like it talks about the importance of narrative. Why it's important, and
the
what
diversity
can come
of its
from it.
perspectives.
What we can learn from it, what we can achieve from story. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, I mean, like when you have the stories within a story, like the warden quotes parables and quotes the Bible, and he is such a hypocritical character. One of my favorite moments is behind the frame of a quote from the Bible is basically the secrets of the warden's dealings, and I guess it's a
ironic.
It's an ironic look because it's also a kind of like tongue in cheek, the whole idea of behind every kind of good like idea is a horrible like secret or maybe say it's not about what's on the outside, it's about what's on the inside. So like behind the frame is the safe.
I love that. Yeah.
So
good.
So these people committed these crimes on the outside, but who they are really is what matters, and I think that's what King and what's the other director's name? Darabont. That's what King and Darabont is trying to emphasize, I think, because the warden's almost like a caricature when he's quoting, but he becomes a very real character when he's scheming. So even at the very end where he says he just disappeared into thin air, hallelujah, he's gone. He's so animated, but when he's when someone delivers him a pie and there's money inside, everything is deliberate. He looks over his shoulder. He feels the money, and it's like that is his true nature. That's who he really is.
Well, both of the guards are like Hadley and Norton. They're both criminals, but yet they're not the ones that are in jail. And I think they deliberately put all these really sadistic scenes in of Hadley like bashing that innocent man and killing him at the start, and Hadley, referring to the prisoners as like not by their names and not giving them an identity, and Hadley kind of smirking when he is allowed to, like he gets the kind of permission from the warden to bash up Andy. He does this like sadistic smile, and it's like, think that it's almost like their corruption is like exaggerated in a way to like make that point.
And can I add on to what you both just saying? Like, I think that's a really important part of the story is how Stephen King, he deliberately inverts the story, the I guess that convention of prison genre or crime. It's the good guys are actually the bad guys. So the good guys are hero Andy and Red, but they're the criminals. But the bad guys are the warden and the
Hadley.
And that sort of that's inverted. Why is it inverted? Why is he doing that? He's deliberately spinning that to show us how, everyday people can be bad as well, and how who we think might be bad actually might be good. Again, getting us to evoking that conversation and allowing audiences to reevaluate aspects of good people and bad people, morality, ethics, etc. We're challenged to reconsider our understanding of what a criminal is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think also Darabont even takes that further from King, because I try not to see it as good guy versus bad guy. I think it's people versus an evil system. Because I think that the prison guards wouldn't be like these, we assume, are reasonable people, right? Based on how we treat Andy. And this is the really funny thing, is that we see the prison guards as like these evil monstrosities and the warden is a evil character. But they wouldn't exist if the prison system wasn't like that.
Yeah, well, I guess they did that famous experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, where they took normal people and they said, you're the guards and you're the prisoners. And even though their power was just like made up, the guards treated the prisoners terribly. And so I think it is a byproduct of a system that is failing and a system that is not working, because the guards are allowed to get away with all of that crime and corruption within the prison system. They're not held accountable. Like, Hadley murders an innocent man, he's not sent to jail for that. It's only until the end where they're found out, but that's only because Andy exposes them from outside of the prison system.
Yeah.
That's so true, yeah.
It's like it takes the idea of like, the innocent have to act to redeem or to, like, the innocent have to act in order to save the humanity of those imprisoned. And that seems, at some altruistic level, or at least some humanitarian level, that is just deeply unfair. And yet we, as a society, we demand more punishment, more harsher sentences, and probably not very little in the way of preventative measures to avoid having young children go down that same path, so then we don't have more people in prison. And yet, in Australia, just like in America, we have more Indigenous incarcerated, and yet they are, 2% of the population, 4% of the population, and they are 30, 40% of our prison system. And if anyone is a betting person, it's not because of their race. It's not because of their community. It is something to do with our system. And if we don't change it, then it's going to continue. And if we don't educate ourselves, which is part of the book symbology, we're going to have a community of innocents, quote unquote, that will continue to incarcerate people and then dehumanize them because we allow it to happen, because we refuse to do anything. Because we go in with this idea of like, we don't trust prisoners. We think that if you committed a crime, of course you have to be punished. I think who's the new president this time? Biden.
Yeah.
Biden famously said in the 90s that I don't care where they come from, we have to punish them. I don't care what their circumstances are, they have to be punished. And that was during the Bill Clinton bill in 1994 or 1995, I think, where just as this film was being released, Bill Clinton releases signs into law this new criminal bill that increased incarcerations 100%.
Wow.
And it's decades later that Bill Clinton says, I made a law that failed. Of course it failed. Like, it was stop and frisk, 3 strikes and you're out. Like, you could commit 2 normal crimes and then maybe steal a Mars bar. And because it's your third catch, you've been caught the third time, you have to go to jail now because of the last thing, because it's 3 strikes, you're out. That is a system that, when you have the hammer as hard and as heavy as you can, then the system is always going to be unfair. And I think today, we now know that.
I think, as well, sort of, I like what you said earlier, like it sort of allowed me to reevaluate like my own thoughts about the film. Like essentially, I guess you can't think of somebody as, in aspects of a binary, good and bad. Nobody is solely good, nobody is solely bad. And I suppose, we can see that in the prisoners, but also one thing that you reminded me of was when the warden was, he could take this contract for, and make his prisoners work, but this mate that he knows needed the contract, and even though there was a bribe exchange happening, like essentially he took the bribe and he chose not to I guess take the contract because that would ruin his friend, and he didn't really want that either. And there are aspects of, I suppose, good in him. Even his intention with the Bible, even though he doesn't really do a good job of it, there is sort of some intent, I suppose. And I think again, that's sort of the purpose of the text, is to make us reconsider our understanding of what a good person is, what a bad person is, how criminals should be viewed, how people should be incarcerated.
And like today's media, especially with prison films, it does two things that kind of upsets me a little bit. That once you see Shawshank Redemption, you realize that all these films don't do it, which is it makes fun of sexual assault, and the second thing is that it celebrates toxic masculinity. The idea that in order to even if you are the good guy, you have to beat up the biggest person there. You have to be macho. You have to you have to be the one that is the most violent in order to survive prison. And then that leads back to sexual assault. The idea of the only people that get sexually assaulted are weak men. Well, it's not necessarily the case. It's the system that allows it to happen. And so when you have The Rock and all these action heroes going to prison and, being beefy macho guys, that sets the wrong kind of impressions as to what is supposed to happen in prison. The idea of, he's the good guy, so he's going to be fine because he's beating up all the bad guys. Like the idea of that, in order to be good in prison, you have to keep beating up the bad people in prison. Is that necessarily like the right way to kind of promote or to portray the prison system, prison life?
Yeah, that's such a great point.
It's like it's reinforcing the fact that we have a broken system, and celebrating that, in my view.
A broken system, which even though this film was released in 1994, it's 2020 now, and it's. I don't think that there has been much change in the system. No.
I mean, at least we can only speak for Australia. At least in some states, preventative programs have been put together. We have fewer incarcerations as we did before because, we have an old 90s show called Cops, the idea of glorifying the fact that cops doing their job and beating the criminals. And then now we actually are understanding that, there's actually corruption in the police system. There's actually some police officers who get away with murder. And we're questioning that now, I think. So I think we're on the right path, but the fact that it's taken 20 years, no, not 15 years, sorry, it's taken 15 years. I mean, it's probably even taken longer than that.
I guess the last thing that I wanted to speak about when it comes to storytelling is coming back to my little pyramid diagram here. So I spoke about the inner story aspects of storytelling with Red and Andy, but I didn't get to speak about the orange boxes there with. So basically here we've got outside the text, right? So we've moved from inside the text now outside the text, and you've got Stephen King's original novella. And then how Frank Darabont adapts that story into to shape a new story through film, right? And I guess, you know, why do people do that? Why do people, you know, retell stories? Why, you know, what's the purpose of that? Why does he shift it into the film form? Do you, you know, I can give you answers, but do you guys want to jump in here briefly? Or
Well, I think what you said about like a novel, I guess you can get more of an insight into the character's motivation, and a novella will always allow for like a further depth of characterization. So yeah, it's interesting like why Darabont chose this film to like as an adaptation.
Right.
Like, do you think to make it more accessible perhaps, or why do you guys think?
I think the film form actually does that. I think it does, like, you know, open to a wider audience, what perhaps the novella form didn't do. Do you know why? I don't know exactly why he chose that particular short story.
Darabont hasn't made many interviews about the film. But when you have a cast and crew, especially when you have an adaptation of Stephen King's work, one of the things that people do with that work is that if it's a unique story, if it stands out, amongst all other prison stories, there's not many like Shawshank Redemption. I think that for Darabont, it probably spoke to him in terms of this is different, this is unique, it's a story that needs to be told.
Yeah. And I think that's I can only assume that's why anybody would choose to adapt another story, is because it moves you. Like, why do you tell stories, or why do you retell stories? Because it relates to something that you're either talking about, or a circumstance in that moment in your life. It serves to sort of as a parable, as like a fable. You know, there's something to learn from someone else's story, and I think that's important. That again, that layering of the storytelling. So we've got the original story novella, and that's turned into another. You know, it's retold, and into the film form. And it's important. He still thinks it's an important story to tell.
Yeah, it's a film that's ahead of its time, I think, because when it did release, I mean, pretty much almost every reviewer out there lambasted the film. They just gave it heaps. They said it was too sentimental. And their biggest complaint amongst all of it is the fact that it was a film about humanizing prisoners, and how dare you? You know, it was almost that kind of reaction of like, why even doing this? And if that's the reaction, I think that is a good reaction, because it's set in motion in the last 15 years. I think public discourse. It's probably the reason why it's 9.2 on IDBM. It touches you on a level where you go, I never thought about that. These people are good characters. Yes, they did horrible things. We shouldn't be treating them like this. And yes, they deserve to go to prison. And at the same time, you also have Andy, who's an innocent person. So then you have the question of capital punishment. You have the question of, how does a system allow innocent people to go into prison? And if you allow one innocent person into prison, then there is something wrong with the system. Do you get rid of the system? And people go, no, you can't. But then how do you change the system so then you don't wrongly convict people? And I think that was too confronting in the 90s, but it's a question that we're grappling with now.
Yeah, well, and again, the film's dated really well. Like, that's what you're saying about it being ahead of its time, because now you have those stories about the Central Park Five that were wrongly convicted, that were a popular series on Netflix, and so it's still a topical film, and it's still like very relevant to today's society.
And meanwhile, you have the outgoing President Trump, who is pardoning all his friends from like crimes that were essentially committed while he was running for his presidency. And it's really interesting. It's almost like life imitating art. You have a warden who is corrupted his way through the very top, and yet you have a system that is broken, and
that is allowing it
to happen.
Well, I guess one last thing that I wanted to point out about storytelling is that the ending, right, with the novella and the film, which I find very interesting, is the novella, it has a different ending to the film. So the short story concludes ambiguously, and readers never really find out if Red actually made it to Mexico. And I think this is important because my understanding is that Darabont wanted to keep the ending, but producers said, no, you have to make it feel good or whatever. And so the film ends in this lovely sort of nice feel good way. But it's a bit of a shame that that Darabont didn't keep the ending, because you have to ask yourself, why does King leave the story open, right? And usually, and this is sort of I guess something that I've come up with again, that it's a way of passing on the power of storytelling to the reader. So you get to the end of that story, you're like, oh, what happens next? Now I, as the reader, get to determine the rest of the story. I get to carry on that story and tell the story. And again, that just adds another layer to my storytelling point, and how it's really important. And I guess essentially, just to sort of sum up, what is the point of any story? What's the point here of Shawshank Redemption? Again, we are forced to question aspects of, prisoner, what a prisoner image, what they look like, the prison system, how we can fix it, what we need to do, and to essentially progress in our society, and offer a safer world for others. And that's I guess what narrative and storytelling can do in us, individuals, and for the greater good.
Right. So if the short story concludes ambiguously, well, I always think that power of an ambiguous ending is that the reader can come up with their own conclusions. So why do you think that Darabont decided to change that?
I don't think he. I don't know where I got this from. I think I read it, or maybe I heard it. Yeah. I heard that he wanted to keep the ending as it was, but they wanted, producers wanted closure.
Okay, yeah.
So he sort of was outvoted on that.
Okay.
But to me, the original ending actually makes sense.
Yeah.
What does happen to Red? Well, that's his journey now is up for us to decide.
Yeah.
And for us to conclude.
Yeah.
And that gives us power.
Yeah.
And I think that's. That's the sort of the power of storytelling. It allows us to think about where we want Red to end up, why we want him to end there, and what that means for us and our society, and how we're going to shape our society. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And one of the really interesting things about the ending is how deeply layered the symbology is, I guess, because throughout the entire film, you have this monotone, kind of grey, unvibrant kind of look to it.
Yeah.
And the colour palette is very consistent up until the very end.
Yeah, the setting is they're surrounded by bricks. Even when we first meet Red, there's this pan that the camera pans up, and it's this dizzying effect, and all it shows is just constant brick wall. It's so it's just very intimidating. And then you have that contrast to the end where you have the wide open space, the aerial shot of the saturated blue and white colors.
In some way, that ending, I to be honest, I actually like the film ending, because what it does is it does give me that feel good, but also the short story, the subtitle is, again, Hope Springs Eternal. So it is a hopeful ending. It is it does give you hope that things can change for the better, and maybe we can progress in our society.
Is that a dangerous idea though? Because that feel good ending, it's how many prisoners does that actually happen to, where do you know what I mean? It's quite an unusual prison escape story that would happen that would be a very rare circumstance. So, like, is it
Absolutely.
a bit of a dangerous way to end the film? Because does it then make us be like, oh, you know, it's okay. Well, with enough perseverance and enough hope, they can escape their circumstances. But then again, I don't know. What do you guys think? Because then I think Tommy's like inserted into the narrative to show you that it doesn't matter how much hope you have, how much desire you have to change. Sometimes you will get, like, your hopes will get crushed, and it's out of your control, kind of thing.
I suppose I was thinking from like an audience perspective, you know, like it gives me hope that things can change and that, you know, there can be success, there can be, you know, redemption stories, there can be reform. But you've got a good point. Like, it, you know, is it a strong enough, you know, call to action kind of message? Is it a good enough kind of?
Because I don't think like that. The ending shows that the prison system can reform. I think it's more that like the individuals can reform, like what you were saying before, because like they're the only reason why they kind of escape is because of Andy digging his way physically out and like having that perseverance, whereas like, and Red is just given, like, his parole is accepted. So then, but then again, like within the prison system, there's never any reform. I don't know. What do you guys think? What are you going to say, Leo?
I think that with the novella, and I'm a big fan of the film, but I think the novella's ending gives us a little bit more agency from an audience point of view to take on your idea, because if we don't know what happens, then, like, you know, let's say I'm thinking of becoming a lawyer and I'm a student, and then like I read this novella and I go, wow, like, what should happen? And maybe that could be like, you know, the spark of change that goes forward from like a student point of view. With the film, because it kind of concludes our agency. It's like, oh, well, we don't have to do anything now.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
yep.
I mean, that's just a really cynical point of view, but it can be interpreted as a film that is time capsuled in its own way. And is it effective in promoting prison reform? And I think it still does, but it does. I do question the ending,
yeah,
even though I like it.
It does as well, but yeah, I agree with your, you know, cynical view that. I think that it's you know, it's dangerous for this idea to say like, oh, you know, anyone can rise up above their above systemic oppression. It's not always the case. Like, yes, obviously there are, I don't know, but you guys might disagree with that. Like, I think in some circumstances, yeah, people do try hard enough to, and they do succeed in escaping their circumstances. But then in other systems, like, people try so hard and they can never get out of their, like, just to give you a real world example, like, the system of, like, not that capitalism is an institution, but like the system of capitalism, you know, you might have a person who does work really hard, but because they're earning minimum wage, they can never quite really escape their situation. So then it's like, you know, but then there's people out there that's saying like, no, if you just work hard enough, you can, you know, gain wealth and you can like give yourself a better life or whatever. Sometimes the system doesn't allow for that.
Yeah, that's analogous of like the idea of you don't care about the circumstances, because someone who works really, really, really hard and they become millionaires, we ignore the fact and they say, oh, I did work hard, but we ignore the fact that maybe their parents got them into a good school, or that their home life was supportive of their life choices. Whereas someone who does work just as hard as that person, but comes from a family life where they don't care about the child. They're surrounded in a community that doesn't have all the resources that they can access to do well.
Yeah, well, like linking it back to the film, like Andy is the one that escapes. He's the one that is the hotshot banker. He's the one that has the most wealth, and then you can compare that to Tommy, who has been in and out of jail since he was 13, and he doesn't, like, both of them try really hard to escape their circumstances, Tommy through the education and Andy through perseverance, but yet they have drastically different outcomes.
And it's the system that destroys Tommy.
Yes, yeah.
Whereas the system because of Andy's education, his background, his lifestyle, and his point of view, and just his circumstances, just like how Brooke is a prisoner of his own circumstances, Andy, he is actually able to escape, and he is not crushed by the system. But Brooks is, Tommy is. And because Red has his experience with Andy, his, I guess you could say, his experience changes because he's exposed to Andy's circumstances, and he sees what Andy can do. And Red's not stupid, so he does end up leaving on his own. But it's like, yeah, because Andy does give Red agency by the end of the film. Because at that point he's like, well, I don't care. And I think the reason why he says he almost like acts as if he doesn't care in his final parole hearing is because he is finally free. He realizes that I may be in prison, but you haven't crushed me. And so he's not crushed. He's like, oh, I don't care. I don't know what do you think. You know, he has that attitude. And then for some stupid reason they go, yep, we'll approve him for being belligerent. You know, it's like, it's crazy, right? Because he's free. Like he's really truly free in his heart.
Yeah, because I definitely thought that he was going to get denied again when they stamped the paper, and it was a shock to me that his parole did get accepted. But yeah, that scene is like after he has finally accepted that Andy's idea that like there's one thing you can't get to, hope.